Let's talk life expectancy in the Middle Ages, because everyone died at 30 is basically a math trick. Infant and child mortality drags the average way down. If you made it past early childhood, lots of people lived into their 50s or 60s. So what was life actually like? Let's break it down.
Chapter 1. The everyone died at 30 myth. Picture a winter morning in a small medieval village. Not the Hollywood kind with dramatic fog and perfectly arranged mud. Real mud. The kind that clings to your shoes like it's trying to keep you there. Smoke curls out of thatched roofs. Somewhere. A church bell doesn't ring because it's cinematic. It rings because time is kept by sound, not by clocks. Inside a dim one-room cottage, a baby is born. No sterile hospital. No monitor beeping reassurance. No just-in-case antibiotics waiting in a drawer. The room is warm only near the fire. And even that warmth has a smell. Wood smoke, old straw, damp wool, and the sharp metallic edge of fear. A midwife is there, maybe an older aunt. Maybe a neighbor who has done this enough times to speak calmly while doing something terrifyingly difficult. When the baby cries, it feels like the whole house exhales. And that, right there, is the part people miss when they toss out the line. Everyone died at 30 because medieval life didn't start with adulthood. It started with a gauntlet. Now, I want you to do something with me. I want you to zoom out from that cottage like the camera is pulling up through the roof, through the smoke, rising above the village. And instead of seeing a single life, you see hundreds of lives. Babies, children, teenagers, adults, elders. And the harsh truth is this. In the Middle Ages, life was not a short straight line. It was a cliff at the beginning. If you were born, the first danger wasn't some dramatic night battle. It was the ordinary stuff. Cold, infection, bad luck. A fever that wouldn't break. Water that looked clear and still carried something your body couldn't fight. A simple cut that turned angry and swollen. A stomach illness that today would be a miserable weekend, and back then could become a funeral within days. And the thing is, none of that makes for a neat little quote. Nobody goes viral saying, "Medieval people sometimes died from dehydration after a bout of diarrhea." It's not catchy, it doesn't fit on a meme. But it's closer to the real story than everyone died at 30. So where did that line come from? It comes from a number, averages, and averages are sneaky. When people say life expectancy was 30, what they often think it means is medieval humans had some built-in expiration date, like they hit 30 and their body just shuts down. Like the Middle Ages were basically a world of 29-year-olds dramatically collapsing into their soup. That's not how it worked. What life expectancy at birth is actually capturing is something much more brutal and much more specific. How many people never made it out of the beginning? Let's make it concrete without turning this into a math class. Imagine two siblings in that village. The first is born, fragile, and doesn't survive infancy. That happened. A lot. Not because medieval parents didn't care, or because they were somehow colder people. Quite the opposite. Parents cared deeply. They just lived in a world where medicine couldn't reliably stop infections, where nutrition could be seasonal and thin, where a bad winter or a contaminated water source could quietly raise the death toll. The second sibling survives, the fever passes, the cough clears, the dangerous weaning period doesn't turn fatal, they grow, they scrape their knees. They learn chores, they get strong, they make it to 10, then 15, then adulthood. Now this second sibling has a real life, an entire medieval life. They work, they marry, they have children. They survive years that are good and years that are hungry. They learn which plants help a stomachache, which neighbors are generous, and which roads are unsafe after dark. They make it to 50, maybe even 60. Now here's the trick. If you average those two lifespans together, you get a number that looks shockingly low. And it tells you something real, that early life was dangerous. But it does not tell you that adulthood was capped at 30. This is why that quote is misleading. It takes a real risk, the brutal risk of childhood, and turns it into a fake rule about adult life. So when you hear everyone died at 30, what you should hear is, a lot of people died before they ever got the chance to become adults. That's the difference between a scary number and an accurate story. And once you understand that, the Middle Ages start to look different. Not easier, definitely not easier, but different. Because if you made it through the most dangerous early years, your odds improved. Not modern improved, not guaranteed improved, but improved in a meaningful way. Plenty of medieval people lived long enough to become grandparents. Plenty lived long enough to develop reputations, to become village fixtures, to see the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. There were old people, not ancient by modern standards, but old enough to be respected, old enough to be tired, old enough to be called on for memory. When did that boundary line change? What happened the last time the harvest failed? Who remembers the year the river froze? That alone should tell you the story is more complex than everyone died at 30. If nobody lived past 30, there's no such thing as a respected elder. There's no old widow in the records. There's no village grandfather telling stories, yet those people existed. Here's another way to think about it. Life expectancy is not a countdown timer. It's not a prophecy for the individual. It's a snapshot of risk across a whole population. It's describing a landscape. And in the Middle Ages, the landscape had a steep drop-off right at the start. Which means the Middle Ages weren't necessarily a world of short lives. They were a world of fragile beginnings. Now, before we romanticize anything because it's easy to swing too far the other way, let's be honest about the other dangers too. Medieval adulthood came with plenty of threats that could end your story early. Workplace injuries, infections, childbirth, violence, famine years, and later on in our story, plague. But those threats hit people unevenly. Your region mattered, your wealth mattered, your job mattered. Whether you lived in a crowded city or a rural village mattered. Whether you lived through a bad run of harvests mattered. Whether you were unlucky enough to be alive during a plague year mattered. And that's part of what makes the topic so fascinating. Medieval life expectancy isn't one number. It's a constantly shifting set of odds depending on the world around you. So let's go back to that baby in the cottage, the one who cried and made the room exhale. If that baby survives the first days, there's relief. Then the first weeks. Then the first winter. Then the first year. Each milestone isn't just cute, it's earned. Each birthday is proof you got through another layer of danger. And that is why the "everyone died at 30" line irritates historians. Because it blurs the most important truth. Medieval people didn't live under a magical age limit. They lived under a constant negotiation with risk, especially early risk. And if they got past that, many went on to live lives that were long enough to include love, work, conflict, routine, sorrow, community, and yes, old age. So when you say life expectancy was low, what you're really describing is not a world where adulthood barely existed. You're describing a world where childhood was a perilous filter that many didn't pass through. Which brings us right to the real question, the one we're going to spend time with next. What were those early years actually like? What were the threats that pulled the averages down so dramatically? What did parents do to try to protect children? What killed people quietly? And what killed people in waves? And how did it feel to live in a world where you could do everything right and still lose? Chapter 2. The Childhood Gauntlet, the most dangerous years of your life. If medieval life expectancy is a cliff at the beginning, then childhood is the climb. Cold fingers, slippery rock, no safety net, and a lot of people falling before they ever reach the top. And the hardest part to wrap your head around from a modern perspective is that the deadliest threats weren't dramatic. Not knights, not duels, not some cinematic battlefield. It was the small stuff, the ordinary stuff, the you wouldn't even Google it stuff. A fever, a cough, a stomach illness, a cut that turned strange, a winter that lasted too long. So let's go back to that baby from chapter 1, the one whose first cry made the room exhale. Because in medieval life, that cry wasn't the finish line, it was the starting gun. The first gate. Birth isn't a moment, it's a risk. We tend to think of birth as a celebration with balloons. In the Middle Ages, it was closer to a trial. Not always. Not inevitably tragic, but always serious. The room is warm near the fire and cold everywhere else. There's no sterile anything. There are hands and cloths and experience. The midwife is the closest thing to an expert, and that expertise matters because she's seen every version of normal and every version of something's wrong. When things go smoothly, everyone thanks God. When things don't, there's often nothing to do but pray and hold on and hope the body does what it's supposed to do. And here's the thing, even if the baby arrives alive, the first danger isn't over. The most fragile period is right now. The hours and days that follow, when infection, exposure, and complications can still steal the win. This is why you see traditions like quick baptisms. It wasn't just religious routine, it was urgency. Families wanted the baby spiritually safe because they knew the physical world was unpredictable. In a time when a child could be lost before they had a personality, the rituals weren't superstition, they were a way to grasp for certainty. The second gate. The first year, the world is trying to kill you quietly. If you're imagining medieval infancy as some peaceful bundle sleeping in a cradle, adjust that picture. Babies were loved, yes. But they were also tiny bodies trying to adapt to a world that wasn't built to keep them alive. Think about the air inside many homes. Smoke from the hearth, heavy and constant. It's not a cozy candle vibe, it's a daily haze. Lungs grow in that environment. Eyes water in that environment. Respiratory infections don't feel like rare events, they feel like a season. Then there's water. Clean water is everything, and clean is not always visible. A stream can look clear and still carry illness. A well can be close to where animals live. Waste disposal is not a modern system with pipes, it's a series of choices. And those choices aren't always safe. Now add a stomach illness. In a modern world, diarrhea is unpleasant. In a medieval world, diarrhea can mean dehydration, and dehydration can mean death, especially for infants. It isn't dramatic, it's just a small body running out of liquid. That's one of the cruelest truths about medieval childhood. You could die without a spectacle. You could slip away from something that today would be a few miserable days and a trip to the pharmacy. How parents fought back because they did. It's easy to picture medieval parents as fatalistic, like they didn't get attached. But that's not what the evidence of human behavior suggests. People grieved, they tried, they adapted. Breastfeeding mattered, not just emotionally, but biologically. It provided nutrition and, importantly, protection. When breastfeeding was possible, it could be a lifeline. Among the wealthy, wet nurses sometimes stepped in, another layer of survival strategy tied to class and custom. Parents and caregivers also used what knowledge they had. Herbal remedies, warming practices, swaddling for warmth and stability, keeping babies close, keeping them fed, keeping them out of drafts. They didn't have germ theory, but they had observation. When we do this, the baby seems stronger. When we do that, the baby gets worse. And when medicine fails, people do what people always do. They reach for meaning. Charms, prayers, saints, blessings. These weren't just medieval weirdness. They were psychological survival tools in a world where the line between life and death could be thin. The third gate, weaning, the hidden danger people forget. There's a quiet turning point in early childhood that doesn't get enough attention. Weaning. Breast milk, when available, was relatively safe and steady. But as children shifted to other foods and liquids, they entered a new risk zone. Now you're introducing porridge, watered drinks, bits of bread, whatever the household has. And this is where contamination, poor storage, and nutritional gaps can hit hard. A child might survive infancy and then get knocked out by a gastrointestinal illness during weaning. Or they might become weaker and more vulnerable to respiratory infection because they're not getting enough calories in a hungry season. This is why medieval childhood risk doesn't feel like one spike. It's more like a series of waves. You get through one, then another hits. The fourth gate, disease doesn't ask permission. Now let's talk about the illnesses that move through childhood like weather. In a medieval community, infectious diseases aren't rare, isolated tragedies. They are part of the environment, something the village expects, fears, and endures. Some come fast, fevers that burn through households. Some come slow, lingering coughs, chronic weakness. Some return again and again. Childhood diseases, things like measles, smallpox in endemic forms, whooping cough, respiratory infections could be devastating without modern supportive care. And it's not just illness, it's the complications. A fever can lead to dehydration, a cough can become pneumonia, a small infection can turn systemic. A simple wound can become dangerous if it festers. Add parasites to the picture, common in environments where sanitation is limited and animals and humans live close. Parasites steal nutrition. They weaken kids over time. A child may survive but not thrive. And remember, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Many families are living right on the edge of enough. So illness doesn't just take health, it takes labor. When a parent is sick, food production suffers. When food production suffers, everyone becomes weaker. It's a feedback loop. Childhood accidents, the other unromantic killer. Now picture a medieval child at age 4 or 5. They're not protected like modern children, they're in the world. They're near fires, near animals, near tools, near water. They climb things, they fall, they get stepped on, they get kicked. They wander into hazards because childhood has always been curious and fearless. And the medieval world is not padded. A fall can mean a broken bone that doesn't heal well. A cut can become infected. A burn can become fatal if it leads to systemic infection. This is why everyday life could be risky even without disease, because injury and infection were a dangerous combo. The emotional reality, love with a shadow over it. Here's what makes medieval childhood especially haunting to imagine. Parents didn't love less. They loved under different conditions. They celebrated milestones more intensely because milestones were proof of survival. The first time a child walks is not just cute, it's evidence the child is strong enough to stand. The first time a child speaks is not just adorable, it's the sound of a future forming. And when a child dies, it's not shrugged off. It's absorbed into a culture that has to keep going. People mourn, and then they work, because winter doesn't pause, fields don't pause, hunger doesn't pause. That doesn't mean grief is smaller, it means grief is woven into life. The turning point, when the odds finally shift. Now we arrive at the moment that changes everything, and it's the whole reason the everyone died at 30 myth collapses. If a child makes it through the most dangerous early years, if they get past infancy, weaning, the early disease waves, something happens. They become more durable. Not invincible, not safe, but more resilient. Their immune system has fought battles. Their body is larger, stronger, better able to survive illness and injury. They're less likely to die from what would have been fatal at 6 months old. This is the medieval secret hidden inside that misleading statistic. Childhood is the filter. And when you hear life expectancy was low, what you should picture is not a village full of adults dropping at 30, but a village where the earliest years were the hardest gate to pass through. That's the childhood gauntlet. And if you survive it, if you reach the age where you can carry water, herd animals, run errands, help in fields or workshops, you are no longer just trying to stay alive. You're starting to build a life. Which brings us to the next chapter, because once you clear childhood, the risks don't disappear, they simply change shape. In Chapter 3, we follow the survivors into adolescence and adulthood, into work, marriage, childbirth, injury, and the everyday risks that defined medieval life after the cliff. Chapter 3, if you made it to 15, work, love, childbirth, and everyday medieval risk. Making it to 15 in the Middle Ages was not a guarantee of a long life, but it was proof you had already beaten the most unforgiving odds. You were no longer the fragile body that could be taken by a single fever or a few days of stomach illness. You were bigger, tougher, and more useful. And that last part mattered because usefulness was survival. Childhood was the cliff. Adolescence was the point where the village began to invest in you as someone who would carry water, lift loads, plant crops, learn a craft, and eventually support others. It also meant the dangers changed shape. They did not vanish. They simply stopped looking like a sickbed and started looking like work, pregnancy, wounds, and the thousand small risks woven into ordinary days. At 15, life did not open into freedom. It opened into responsibility. In a rural village, that could mean full days in the fields, in the byre, in the woods, or wherever your household needed you most. In a town, it might mean apprenticeship, which sounds romantic until you picture what it really is. Long hours in smoke and heat, repetitive labor, sharp tools, heavy materials, and a master who expects you to learn by doing and by making mistakes you cannot afford to repeat. Even if you lived at home, your body was now expected to contribute at adult intensity. There was no clear line between adolescence and adulthood when the household depended on every capable pair of hands. Work was the center of medieval health in two opposing ways. On one hand, constant movement built strength. Most people walked everywhere. They lifted, carried, chopped, hauled, kneaded, scrubbed, climbed, and worked outdoors in all weather. That kind of labor can create remarkable endurance. On the other hand, it made bodies vulnerable to injury and exhaustion in a world where injuries could become life-threatening. A twisted ankle was not inconvenient when you could rest and ice it. It was dangerous when your livelihood required walking, and infection could turn a small wound into a systemic threat. A cut from a tool could be a minor annoyance or the start of something that swelled, darkened, and never stopped spreading. The medieval day is full of hazards that do not look heroic. Animals are strong, unpredictable, and always nearby. A kick from a horse, a goring from a cow, a bite from a dog guarding a yard, a pig that decides your foot is food, a fall in a barn loft, a cartwheel that catches you wrong. Fire is constant, open and closed. Burns happen. Smoke irritates lungs. Sparks catch on cloth. A child who survived infancy might be taken at 17 by an accident near the hearth, not because the Middle Ages were uniquely cursed, but because the living environment had fewer barriers between daily life and physical danger. And then there are the risks that come from being out in the world. Roads are not simply paths, they are exposure. A trip to market means leaving the safety of familiarity, crossing woods, passing strangers, and entering crowds. Crowds bring opportunity, gossip, theft, and disease. Towns can be louder, richer, and more exciting than villages, but they can also be harsher on health. More people packed close together means more infections circulating, more waste to manage, more contaminated water, and more chances for outbreaks to tear through neighborhoods. Even without a dramatic epidemic, cities tend to be harder places to stay healthy if sanitation is poor and bodies are underfed or overworked. Food sits at the heart of survival, and it is more complicated than the myth of constant starvation. Many medieval people ate enough in ordinary years, but enough did not always mean varied, and it did not mean stable. Seasons ruled the table. The diet could be heavy on grains and whatever vegetables could be stored or grown, with meat more common in some regions and households than others. A bad harvest did not just mean hunger, it meant weakened bodies, and weakened bodies meant ordinary illnesses became dangerous. A run of lean months could quietly raise the death toll without anyone needing to swing a sword. If your immune system is running on empty, a winter cough becomes pneumonia, a minor infection becomes a fatal fever, and recovery takes longer than the calendar allows. Disease still mattered in adolescence and adulthood, but it often mattered differently. You might survive illnesses that would have killed you at age 2, yet still be worn down by chronic infections, parasites, or recurring fevers. There is also the constant risk of complications. A wound can be the entry point, a tooth infection can spread. A respiratory illness can settle in the chest and linger. Without reliable antiseptics and antibiotics, the line between a routine illness and a disaster stays thin. It is not that medieval bodies were weaker by nature. It is that the support system for recovery was limited and the environment did not pause to let you heal. Now layer in the social expectations that begin to press harder once you are old enough to be useful. Relationships are not just romance, they are household strategy. Marriage, when it happens, ties families together, secures labor, secures alliances, and produces children who will keep the household alive. Love exists, but love is rarely separate from economics. Even when people marry young, it does not always mean they instantly become parents, but the pressure to produce heirs or helpers is present. Especially when child death is common, the household wants redundancy because redundancy is survival. If a harvest fails or a disease takes someone, the family cannot afford to collapse. For women, adolescence and adulthood bring a particular kind of risk that shapes life expectancy in ways people often underestimate. Pregnancy and childbirth are not single events. They can be repeated cycles across a lifetime. Each birth carries dangers: hemorrhage, infection, complications from difficult labor, and the vulnerability of the weeks after delivery. Even when a mother survives, repeated pregnancies can weaken the body, especially if nutrition is limited. The medieval world has midwives, experience, and care, But it lacks many of the interventions that turn a complicated birth into a survivable one today. This is why women can face a different risk profile than men, not because women are inherently weaker, but because their role in reproduction exposes them to a recurring high-stakes biological gamble. Men face their own version of risk that often arrives through labor and violence. Many adult deaths do not come from war as much as from the everyday violence of a rough society. Fights, feuds, assaults, accidents during disputes, or injuries that happen in contexts where tempers run hot and weapons are common. Even small-scale violence has consequences when healthcare is limited. A cut that might be stitched and treated today can turn deadly. A blow to the head can leave lasting damage. A broken bone can heal poorly and make someone vulnerable to hunger because they cannot work as effectively. Violence does not need to be constant to shape life, it only needs to be possible. If you are unlucky enough to be drawn into war, the danger is not limited to the battlefield. Armies are hungry machines. They move through landscapes consuming food, spreading illness, displacing communities, and disrupting planting and harvest. A village can be harmed without a single sword striking a villager simply because the fields are trampled, the stored grain is taken, and winter arrives as usual. Even for those not fighting, war changes the odds. It tightens resources. It pushes people into crowded refuge. It encourages disease. It creates injuries, hunger, and instability that echo for years. Yet even in this world of risk, people do not live as if they are doomed. They adapt because adaptation is how humans survive everywhere. Communities develop routines that protect life in small ways. Sharing labor at harvest, looking after a neighbor who is sick, pooling resources, keeping certain spaces for certain tasks, learning which water sources are safer, and relying on social networks when a household is hit by misfortune. The most overlooked medieval technology is not a tool, but a relationship. A family with allies has better odds than a family alone, because when illness or injury hits, someone else can bring food, watch children, or help with work that cannot be delayed. This is also the stage of life where you start to see what the misleading number fails to capture: the possibility of middle age. A person who reaches adulthood and avoids catastrophic years can live long enough to become someone with a history, someone known for their craft, someone whose back aches in winter and whose hands are scarred from decades of labor, someone who has buried children but also raised others to adulthood, someone who has seen the village change and remembers what happened the last time the river flooded or the harvest failed. These people exist because medieval adulthood is not automatically short. It is conditional. It depends on whether your body can withstand work, whether you avoid fatal infections, whether childbirth spares you, whether violence misses you, and whether the wider world stays stable enough for food to be steady. And stability is the key word because medieval risk is not only personal, it is environmental. One person can do everything right and still lose because the world shifts under their feet. A run of cold summers, a series of failed harvests, a war that disrupts trade, or a disease wave that hits the region can suddenly raise the danger level for everyone, regardless of age. This is why medieval life expectancy is not simply a story about individual choices. It is a story about living in a world where the baseline is manageable in good years, punishing in bad years, and occasionally catastrophic. By the time you reach 15, you are no longer trying to survive childhood. You are trying to survive adulthood, which is a different kind of test. It is less about fragility and more about endurance. Less about the first fever and more about the accumulation of risks. Work will shape your body. Love will shape your household, and the realities of reproduction and labor will shape how long your story can stretch. And then, hovering behind everything like a shadow that sometimes turns into a storm, there are the big shocks that can rewrite the odds in a single season. Because for all the daily dangers of medieval life, nothing alters the landscape of survival like the years when the world turns against you all at once. When hunger spreads, armies move, and disease does not politely stay contained. That is where the next chapter takes us, into the moments when medieval risk stops being personal and becomes collective. When survival becomes less about one household and more about whether an entire society can withstand the blow. Chapter 4. When the World Turns. Famine, War, and the Black Death. Famine, war, and plague were not new ideas in the Middle Ages, but when they struck together, they didn't just kill people, they rearranged the map of what survival meant. Imagine you've lived through childhood, worked your way into adulthood, and finally carved out something resembling stability. A small plot of land, a routine, maybe children who've survived infancy. Then, without warning, the entire rhythm of life shifts. The weather changes, crops fail, food prices climb beyond what anyone can pay. Armies move through the countryside, disease follows the roads, and suddenly all the careful work of staying alive feels irrelevant, because the rules of the game have changed. It often began with the sky. Medieval people did not have meteorology, but they were careful observers of weather. They could tell when the seasons felt wrong, and in the early 1300s the weather turned against them. Rain came and didn't stop. The summers were too cold to ripen grain. Fields flooded, harvests rotted, and livestock starved. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe faced what became known as the Great Famine. In many places, seed grain was eaten out of desperation, ensuring the next year's harvest would fail too. People slaughtered work animals because feeding them was impossible. Bread became rare, then precious, then impossible. Even noble households struggled, which meant the poor, who depended on the leftovers of the wealthy, had nothing. Hunger has a way of making morality flexible. In desperate years, stories emerge of people stealing food from churches, grinding bark or acorns into flour, even eating the dead. Whether every story is true hardly matters. What matters is that hunger stripped away the illusion of stability. It revealed how thin the safety net was. Those with even small reserves could survive. Those without them vanished quietly. And when famine loosened its grip, disease moved in to claim the weakened. Malnutrition had set the stage for the next wave of mortality. War rarely waited for peace to return. The 14th century was a long century of fighting, from the endless back and forth of the 100 Years' War to smaller local feuds that burned like brush fires across regions. For the ordinary person, war wasn't the grand clash of kings. It was soldiers taking food, taking livestock, burning fields to deny resources to the enemy, and leaving plague in their wake. A marching army meant the countryside emptied or hid. War brought famine with it, not only because of destruction, but because labor couldn't return to normal rhythms. Crops needed tending at specific times. If you missed the window, the harvest failed even in good weather. And if you lost your oxen or plow, you might not recover for years. Armies also carried more than weapons. They carried disease. Soldiers moved through crowded camps, unsanitary and packed with refugees, prostitutes, and traders. Lice, fleas, and contaminated water turned these camps into laboratories for infection. When the soldiers moved, the diseases moved with them, along roads that connected towns and markets. For people living along those routes, survival meant praying that armies didn't pass nearby, because when they did, they brought not just violence, but the invisible passengers that would change the course of history. No event captures that change more completely than the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, plague killed tens of millions across Europe, at least 1 in 3 people, often far more. It began, historians believe, in Asia, traveling along trade routes to the Mediterranean. The first reports describe a disease so sudden and so horrifying that it defied explanation. People went to bed well and were dead within days. Black swellings, the buboes that gave the disease its name, appeared in the groin or armpit, spreading infection through the bloodstream. Some accounts mention people bleeding from the nose or coughing blood, suggesting multiple plague forms at once. In cities, entire neighborhoods were emptied. In villages, sometimes no one was left to bury the dead. Imagine what it felt like to watch that unfold. You wouldn't know about bacteria, you wouldn't have microscopes or theories of contagion. You would know only that people around you were dying, faster than anyone could comprehend. Priests, doctors, and merchants fell alike. Wealth offered no protection except escape. And even that didn't always work. Some fled to the countryside, bringing the plague with them. Others locked themselves away and starved. Whole villages vanished. Chroniclers describe grass growing over streets, silence where bells used to ring, families who sealed themselves indoors and never came out. Panic breeds explanations, and in the 14th century, explanations often turned cruel. Without understanding infection, people turned to the spiritual and the social. Maybe God was angry. Maybe sin had poisoned the world. Maybe the stars had aligned in a deadly way. And maybe, some said, it was the fault of outsiders. Jewish communities were blamed and massacred in dozens of cities, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil. Fear made people violent, violence made fear worse, and yet, amid all of this, there were also acts of care, clergy who stayed to comfort the dying, neighbors who risked themselves to help families no one else would touch, small attempts to make unbearable loss meaningful. The numbers defy imagination. Some towns lost half their population, some monasteries 3/4. For a few years, it felt as if the world itself was ending. And then slowly, the plague moved on. Not because it was defeated, but because there were too few living hosts left to sustain it. Fields lay untended, buildings collapsed, roads fell silent. Even the air felt changed. When survivors emerged, they faced a world transformed. The consequences of that transformation rippled for generations. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Suddenly, peasants could demand higher wages or better terms from landowners who needed their work. In England, this led to friction and eventually revolt when the ruling classes tried to freeze wages. Across Europe, social hierarchies wobbled. The assumption that everyone would stay in their place no longer held. Entire crafts were lost when master artisans died without apprentices. But new opportunities appeared too. Land that once required whole families could now be managed by fewer. Forests regrew, game returned. Food prices dropped for those who survived and diets improved. The church, which had been the backbone of medieval life, also faced a reckoning. So many priests and monks had died, many while ministering to the sick, that replacements were hastily trained and often less disciplined. Faith itself changed tone. People sought personal piety, pilgrimages, and private devotion rather than relying solely on institutions. Death was everywhere, and it entered art, language, and thought. The dance of death motif appeared in paintings and carvings, skeletons leading kings and peasants alike, a reminder that mortality spared no one. The Black Death did not destroy medieval faith, it made it more urgent, more personal, and more haunted. For some survivors, the aftermath brought a strange kind of freedom. With so many gone, the world felt wider. There was more land, less crowding, new space to imagine different ways of living. Cities that recovered often rebuilt differently. Cleaner streets, better air circulation, new rules about waste disposal. It was not yet modern sanitation, but it was the first hint that lessons had been learned. Trade routes reopened. Cautiously, art and innovation followed because catastrophe often leaves behind a hunger for beauty and meaning. Yet plague never truly disappeared. It came back in waves, smaller, regional, but terrifying echoes of the original horror. Each outbreak reminded survivors how thin the line was between normal life and chaos. And for the ordinary medieval person, the farmer, the craftsman, the widow, the orphan, what remained was not just grief but adaptation. Survival meant learning to live in a world where certainty had died. Families rebuilt with whoever was left. Villages reconstituted themselves around gaps. Children inherited earlier. Women sometimes stepped into roles men once held, because necessity doesn't wait for permission. Over time, life resumed its rhythm, but it was never quite the same rhythm again. The memory of the years when the world turned stayed in the collective mind, in the stories told at firesides, in the way people measured luck and feared bad air and prayed for steady seasons. When we look back at famine, war, and plague, it's tempting to see only catastrophe. But to the people who lived through them, these were not separate events, they were overlapping pressures that tested everything. Hunger weakened you, war displaced you, plague finished the job, yet somehow humanity endured. The Middle Ages didn't end with the Black Death, they adapted their way through it, reshaped by loss, sharpened by memory, and propelled toward a world that would eventually start asking new questions about science, health, and the human condition itself. The world turned, and somehow people kept turning with it. Chapter 5. Who Beat the Odds? The Secrets of Medieval Longevity. Longevity in the Middle Ages was never a simple reward for being tough. It was a mix of luck, timing, environment, and a handful of advantages that seem almost boring until you realize how powerful they were. The people who beat the odds were not necessarily the strongest, bravest, or most virtuous. They were the ones whose lives contained fewer sharp edges, fewer famine years, fewer infected wounds, fewer pregnancies that went wrong, fewer winters spent underfed, fewer nights breathing smoke in a crowded room, fewer days spent in a city during an outbreak. In a world where survival could hinge on the small and invisible, the greatest advantage was often the absence of misfortune. The first and biggest secret is also the simplest. Surviving childhood did most of the heavy lifting. Once you reached the age where you had weathered the common early illnesses, made it through weaning, and grown into a more resilient body, you had already moved into a different category of risk. You could still die young, but you were no longer as easily erased by a brief sickness that drained your fluids or spiked a fever beyond what a small body could manage. This is why the medieval world could produce elders at all. Not elders in every household, not elders everywhere, but enough that communities recognized age, valued memory, and relied on those who had lived long enough to remember the last disaster and warn the young about what comes next. The second secret was stability of food, and it mattered more than most people imagine. Medieval diets were not universally miserable, but they were vulnerable to sudden collapse. If your household could keep a steady baseline of calories through winter and lean seasons, your entire life trajectory changed. That stability might come from land quality, from having enough tools and animals to farm efficiently, from being connected to a manor with stored grain, or from living in a region with more reliable harvests. It could also come from the simple advantage of not being pushed to the edge by rent, taxes, or debt. A body that is consistently fed is harder to kill, it heals faster, it resists infection better. It survives bad years that would break someone living one missed harvest away from starvation. The third secret was distance from crowding, which usually meant living outside dense towns. Medieval cities were engines of opportunity and also engines of disease. More people in close quarters meant faster spread of respiratory infections, more waste to manage, more contaminated water sources, and more frequent outbreaks. Rural life carried its own hazards, but it offered one quiet advantage: space. Fewer bodies packed together often meant fewer constant exposures, and in a world without antibiotics, reducing exposure could be the difference between a long life and a short one. This did not make the countryside safe, but it could make it survivable in a way that certain neighborhoods in certain towns simply were not. Then there is the secret nobody wants to hear because it sounds unfair, which is that class mattered. Wealth bought insulation from risk. It could buy better food, warmer clothing, sturdier housing, and the ability to rest when sick rather than pushing through illness because labor could not stop. It could buy distance from the worst sanitation, and it could buy the option to leave when danger arrived. But wealth was not a magical shield. The wealthy sometimes ate diets that led to chronic problems and excess, and elites also faced risks that peasants did not, including political violence and the brutal consequences of war. Still, in the blunt arithmetic of survival, being able to avoid hunger and exposure was a significant advantage. The people who lived longer were often the people whose lives were less physically punishing and more buffered against sudden disaster. At the same time, there is a twist that complicates the easy story. Not all labor was equal. Some work was relatively steady and survivable. Other work was a conveyor belt of injury and infection. A farmer might live decades if harvests were decent and accidents were avoided, because the body became strong and routine offered predictability. But mining, certain forms of metalwork, heavy transport, and work with repeated cuts and burns increased the odds of complications. Longevity often belonged to those whose work did not constantly put their bodies into the kind of danger that a medieval medical system could not reliably repair. One catastrophic injury or one infected wound could erase years of careful survival. People who lasted were often the people who avoided the one bad accident that changed everything. Women faced a different set of probabilities, and longevity for them was often connected to reproductive timing and outcome. Childbirth was a recurring gamble, and repeated pregnancies stacked risk over time. Women who lived long often did so because they avoided the worst childbirth complications, had enough nutrition to recover, and sometimes because their reproductive years were shorter or less intense than those of women who bore many children back to back. This does not mean motherhood always shortened life, but it did mean that a woman's path to old age was shaped by a cycle of risks men did not face in the same way. Surviving adulthood as a woman could require surviving not one crisis but many, repeated across years, with little margin for error. Another group often associated with longer life were those living in religious communities, and not because monasteries were hospitals or because monks had secret cures. They had something simpler: routine, shelter, and more consistent access to food. Monastic life could reduce exposure to certain forms of violence and provide care when illness struck. Even if that care was limited, it also created an environment where people were less likely to be pushed into the extremes that kill. A steady schedule, stable meals, and communal support do not sound heroic, but in a medieval context, they could be powerful. The difference between a life that ends at 40 and a life that reaches 60 can be the difference between being forced to work through sickness and being allowed to recover. Community itself was another form of protection. In a world without modern healthcare, the real safety net was often social. Longevity could be reinforced by having relatives nearby, neighbors who shared labor, a village that helped in times of injury, and networks that prevented a single sickness from turning into starvation. If you were sick and alone, you were at the mercy of time. If you were sick and supported, you might survive long enough for the fever to break. Medieval people who lived long often lived inside strong webs of mutual obligation, because survival was not purely individual, it was collective. A household with allies could endure shocks that would destroy an isolated family. Timing mattered more than any virtue. Some people reached old age because they were born into a relatively calm stretch, avoiding the worst famine years or the most lethal plague wave. Others lived long because they were geographically lucky, living in a place that was hit later or less intensely by catastrophe. Even within the same region, two nearby communities could have very different experiences depending on trade routes, population density, and local responses. Longevity could be decided by whether the disease arrived before harvest or after, whether it reached the village at all, whether the household had the means to isolate, and whether the year's food supply could withstand disruption. It is hard to overstate how much medieval survival could be shaped by chance. So what did old age look like when someone actually reached it? It was not a gentle retirement. It was a body that carried its history openly. Worn joints, chronic pain, missing teeth, scarred hands, and fatigue that settled deeper each winter. Yet it was also a kind of status, especially in communities where memory mattered. An older person could hold authority simply by having seen more. In a world where written records were limited, lived experience was a resource. Elders remembered where boundaries lay, which families owed favors, what happened the last time the river flooded, and how communities recovered from loss. Longevity was not just personal, it was socially valuable. When you put all of this together, the secret of medieval longevity stops being mysterious. It becomes a pattern. The people who lived long were often those who survived childhood, had relatively stable access to food, avoided overcrowded disease environments, dodged the worst accidents and infections, and lived inside communities that could carry them through illness. Wealth increased those odds, but it did not guarantee them. Poverty decreased those odds, but it did not eliminate them. Monastic routine helped, but it was not magic. Rural life reduced some dangers and increased others, and hovering over every individual story was the unpredictable weight of famine, war, and plague. the forces that could compress lifespans in a single season. The myth that everyone died at 30 collapses when you meet the reality of who actually lived. The Middle Ages contained tragedies that shaped averages downward, especially in the earliest years, and it contained catastrophes that could erase stability overnight. But it also contained lives long enough to accumulate decades of labor, love, loss, and memory. Longevity existed not as the norm, but as a real and recognizable outcome for those who threaded the needle through a dangerous world. And that is the most enlightening way to think about medieval life expectancy. Not as an age limit, but as a landscape of risks. Childhood was the steepest cliff. Adulthood was endurance with sharp edges. Catastrophes were storms that could flatten entire regions. And within that landscape, some people still made it to the far side, living long enough to become the kind of person a village points to and says, without needing words, that they have seen enough to know what matters.